Obviously, if you want to learn historical martial arts, or any martial art, or any skill for that matter in general, there's no substituting a competent instructor teaching you. You're never going to get the same results by yourself as you would learning with other students and getting professional instruction. Can you learn with other beginners with instructional material but without an instructor? Sort of. Not in an optimal way. You'll probably develop bad habits. On the upside, you're not preparing for war, right? This is a recreational activity. This is an interest. You don't need to learn sword fighting to save your life. In that case, is it better than nothing? Sure. And if your goal is simply to have fun, socialize, and exercise in a way you enjoy, you're doing it right. What if either you don't have access to that, or if you want to go the extra mile and practice by yourself in addition to taking classes, which is always a good idea, how can you go about it? So just to get that out of the way, realistically, if you're by yourself, right, you don't even have friends to practice with, and you don't have an instructor, realistically, you cannot learn martial arts. That doesn't mean you can't do anything, though. You're going to be better off than someone who does nothing, right? Even at the risk of perhaps developing some bad habits. So, of course, you can look at the historical manuscripts. If you want to practice historical martial arts, you have to look at the sources. Otherwise, it's not historical martial arts. So you have Wiktenauer, for example, to go to. There are a lot of manuscripts there, and there are plenty of instructional videos. That's what I would recommend first and foremost, because if you try to approach the original sources without prior knowledge and without instruction, it's going to be very difficult, because a lot of it is written not with great detail. They don't explain everything. Like, for example, footwork, which we're going to get to, or how to hold a sword and things like that. They don't explain that. The later manuscripts more so, but earlier on, it's not going to be much in that regard. And they were written more as a supplementary source for people who already have a teacher. All right, so keep that in mind. But there's plenty of free resources available online. There's lots of instructional HEMA videos on YouTube. So that's where I would recommend starting. Of course, in the beginning, you're not going to know what's high quality instruction, what's not so good, what's a better interpretation and a less accurate one. There's just no way around it, but you have to start somewhere. So I'm going to give you a few tips on how to practice by yourself. First off, what to practice with. I made a video recently about what I consider the best options in terms of swords for beginners. I'm going to link that down below. Just one thing I want to add here. If you only have the budget for one sword, but you would like to practice both single-handed and two-handed, this is a decent option. You know, a messer with a particularly long handle, the longest blade you can find, I suppose. You can practice single-handed and you can practice two-handed. Of course, this is significantly shorter than a longsword or a Kriegsmesser and weighs quite a bit less. But as long as the handle gives you enough room for two hands with space in between, because you don't want your hands to be crammed together like this. You want to be able to use a handshake grip. We'll get back to that in a bit. You can still practice longsword techniques like this, even though it feels a little bit off due to just how light it is. But you know, can you do it? Of course you can. Now, if you're on no budget, can you simply grab a stick and use that? Yes. It's not going to be as good as a sword, of course, because swords are differently weighted and balanced and have actual handles and guards and things you do with them. But if, you know, it's better than nothing. Once again, you can still swing this around and practice, you know, your angles and your lines of attack and all that. This is still doable, right? You can practice your guards, you know, all of that. Better than nothing. I would generally recommend either practicing in front of a mirror or recording yourself when you're doing it to check, because there are plenty of things you're not seeing. You're not aware of exactly what every part of your body is doing. So sometimes you may look at it and like, why did I do that? And then you can focus on fixing that particular thing. I'll probably see some things while editing this video and go like, the hell is that? I know better, but then I can fix it. So where do you start? At the bottom. The foundation that everything else is built upon is what you do with your feet. Before we get into the nitty-gritty details, I would really appreciate if you consider joining my Patreon if you haven't already. Whether it be to toss me $2 a month as general support, or if you'd like to pick one of the tiers that come with perks, like access to an exclusive Discord server, or bonus content like longer ad-free edits, behind-the-scenes videos, or occasional instructional videos, every bit helps keep me going and cover costs, and you might like the bonus stuff. Hopefully. Otherwise I'd be doing something wrong. And that can't possibly be... Here's a good place to start. Your feet are about shoulder width apart, maybe a little bit wider, and then you take a fairly long step forward and sink low. What's the point of that? Well, you're spreading your base, making it more stable. That way you're not being easily knocked around, and you can work with that. You can push off your feet. We'll get to that. There are different variations on that depending on which manuscript you look at. Some are quite wide and deep. Others are a little bit closer. The foot position can vary. You can have both feet pointed forward with varying degrees of heel lift, if any. You can have the rear foot point at an angle, either perpendicular or at a 45-degree angle, or you can have both feet turned out. In fact, the front foot can even be turned inward, and some guards have it turned pretty strongly. So you have to go by what's the standard for your style. If you can't figure it out, again, ideally you would have an instructor for that who tells you. But if not, you can just go with a fairly neutral stance. You can make it depend on your personal comfort. You know, does it feel better to have both feet forward? Do you like both turned outward? You know, just play around with it a little bit and see what feels comfortable, because everybody's anatomy is a little bit different, of course. Some people may prefer a deeper stance, a wider stance. Some people may prefer a little bit closer. What's the difference anyway? There are benefits and trade-offs. If you're using a pretty wide stance, you have a bit more stability and your passing steps cover more ground, right? If I do this, I can get pretty far, right? But advancing and retreating steps don't go as far because your feet are already this far apart. There's only so much further you can go, right? Whereas a shorter stance doesn't go as far with passing steps, but it can go quite a bit further with advancing and retreating steps, and you can lunge further. If my feet are already pretty far apart, I'm not going to get that much further with a lunge. Like I can try to lean into it and get a little bit more reach out of it. But if they're closer together, I can, from all the way over here, I can lunge pretty far. But in a wide stance, I can use a gathering step to cover even more ground. In fact, so much that my blade would end up in the wall if I did that. So it's not that one is better than the other, it's just, you know, different stances for different purposes. What does that mean for a beginner? Again, depends on the source you're going with, but to play it safe, just do the middle ground. And then you need to learn how to step. You may think, well, I already know how to walk. But this ain't walking. What's walking? Basically, you fall forward and let your feet catch up. That's it. It's the most energy efficient way to move around, which is why we're doing it. You don't want the most energy efficient way. You want the hard way. You push off with your rear leg. And you push off with that, and then you take the step forward. And you make sure that your hips are rotating. Some styles do have a more forward-facing body posture, but typically your hips are pointed at about a 45-degree angle, a little bit this way. So as you step, your hips rotate like this, right? They change from one side 45 to another, and there is a point to that because this helps you power your actions. Imagine there are two ropes tied to your pelvis. If your left leg is forward, then the left side would be attached behind you and the right side is attached in front. So as you're stepping, your right side is getting pulled forward by that rope, you know, the right side of your hip, and the left side is getting pulled backwards. So boom, like this. With the right foot forward, of course, it's the other way around. The rope on your left side is pulling you forward and the rope on the right side is pulling you back. So boom. Like that. What's the point? You're driving forward like this. It's not just a lazy step like this, it's actually snapping forward. You can, of course, simply transfer your weight to the front foot and then just reach with the other foot. And that may not be wrong depending on which system you're practicing. But if you actually learn to engage the hips, there's a lot more power in it. Maybe you can see and or hear the difference. So if I step and cut without engaging my hips, now with the hips, quite a bit more powerful. If you're struggling with that hip engagement at first, don't worry too much about it. Just kind of keep it in the back of your mind. You're going to have to learn one thing at a time. In the beginning, if you try to do everything at once, it's just going to fall apart. So if you need to focus on something else, like just how your feet are moving without doing anything with your hips, that's totally fine. And then there's the advancing and retreating step. You may see other terms for it, but that's what I like to call it. What happens here is you're pushing off with the rear leg to take a short step forward, right? And with this, make sure that you're actually lifting the feet off. It's pretty easy when you're in a gym environment with nice, flat, smooth floors to just be like, If it's squeaking that much, you might want to work on lifting a little bit more, because if you did this outside with uneven ground, you're going to find out pretty quickly that that's not so optimal. Weight distribution depends on what you're doing. You may shift the weight more forward or more backward. Either way, this default is fairly even, like 50-50 or 60-40, something like that. And importantly, you want to be on the balls of your feet, right? So don't plant on the heels, but on the balls of the feet. You don't necessarily have to lift off your heels, but be sure that you're working on the balls of the feet, because that's just more agile overall, as opposed to, just clunking on the heels of your feet. You want to be light-footed, and this allows you to move a little bit faster and just shift your weight more easily. For this kind of step, the basic rule is that whichever leg is closer to the direction that you're going in moves first. If you want to sidestep or strafe, if you will, if your right leg is forward and you want to go to the left, then the left leg is closer to that direction, so that goes first. Vice versa, you want to step to the right, and of course, if you switch it up, same thing. When you're doing this, try to keep the width the same. So as you're stepping, try to keep the distance between the feet consistent. So don't widen your stance unless you mean to, and don't make it narrower or otherwise place it incorrectly. In sparring, you can't expect everything to be textbook perfectly clean all the time. You may absolutely end up with your feet placed a little bit differently, depending on what you have to do, but that comes with experience. In the beginning, you should try to be pretty textbook and pay attention to the distance between your feet. If you know advancing steps, you know lunges too, pretty much. Because what's a lunge? It's basically an advancing step without pulling the rear leg in. There are other more advanced steps, which I believe I've covered in a separate video about footwork specifically, which I'll link down below. But this is the bread and butter. You want to practice this a lot until you're tired of it, and then practice some more. On to using the sword. First off, how do you grip it? Well, it depends. The most common is a handshake grip. So you're not clenching your fist and wrapping all fingers around tightly. With some swords you might. Open your fingers, rotate it forward until it's just resting on the index finger, and then you're wrapping your fingers around, right? Don't go too far, right? Don't grab it like this, but think about the sword resting in the web of your hand, pretty much, right? Again, this varies depending on the kind of sword, right? So that's a pretty common grip. This does a few things. One is it rotates the point forward and brings the blade into better alignment with your forearm for more effective thrusts. It also gives you a little bit more reach, and it allows you to jumpstart your cut. You let the handle rest mostly on your index finger, maybe index and middle finger, and the handle otherwise is resting against the base of your thumb. like this. So then you're able to tighten the bottom fingers for a snap. If you're using a single-handed sword, what to do with the other hand is really largely up to you. You can put it on your back, you can put it on your hip, you can have it in front of your chest, which can be a little bit risky because if your hand is out here, it's a target, right? It can be hit where if it's here or on your back or on the hip, it's not available as a target. You just got to be aware of what you're doing with it. If your hand has a tendency to kind of drift and move forward when you're not actively using it, it might be available as a target. Usually people are taught to swing their entire arm with the sword, but I think it's a good idea to start with this because this is already a cut. You can see that the blade is moving forward. If you combine that with a lunge, pop, that's already a cut. A pretty weak one, but a fast one, and it's definitely viable to arms and hands. Once you've got that down, you can bring the elbow into it as well. Try to stick to fairly rigid angles in the beginning. I would say just do the downward 45s. Don't even worry about undercuts in the beginning, whatever. The bread and butter, again, is this. It's the most common. So try to keep it pretty clean, right? So align it, more or less 45. Keep it slow at first, but then you can speed up a little bit more. And make sure you're not overswinging. What I mean is, if you're ending up all the way over here, that's not good. That exposes you way too much. Depends a little bit on the sword. With some, you can kind of follow through and come back to a guard, but it's good to stop it a little bit earlier. Remember the image of getting ropes implanted into your hip bone? That's still relevant here. So instead of just doing this with your arm, you can turn your body into it and help power it that way. So in the beginning to learn it, it's good to exaggerate, and then you can work on tightening the movement. So as your sword comes over here, your hips are turning in that direction, right? So hips are pointing over here, and then as you're cutting, they're rotating. Don't overdo it. Don't do this number, that's too far. You just want to engage them. You just want to activate the hips. With backhand cuts, it can be a little more difficult, and don't worry too much about it if you're struggling with it in the beginning. One thing that may help to get it down is to rotate the feet. Remember, weight on the balls of your feet. So if you're doing a backhand cut, like as your hips move over to the side from which the cut is coming, your foot turns, and then as the cut comes out, the foot engages. You may be eager to hit things like a dummy or a pell, whether it be a wrapped wooden post or an old pyre or your high school bully. That's good to do, but I would recommend cutting the air more than anything else. There are certain things you can get away with when you're hitting a thing, like overswinging. So if you do this, you're doing a bit too hard. Then you need to try to stop it a little bit earlier. So maybe you don't want to do that. It's definitely good to practice that as well, but I wouldn't do it exclusively. And it's also important to focus on what you do afterwards. Like if you hit something and you leave the sword out there for a bit without doing anything with intent, you need to be aware of that. So not just, oh, okay, but rather cut, guard, cut, guard. By the way, be careful about cutting toward your lead leg. In fact, in the beginning, don't do it. If you're right-handed and your left leg is forward, you don't want to cut this way. You'd be cutting toward your leg. It's not that easy to actually hit your leg, but people have done it. You can mess up and just kind of lean over or get the angle wrong or something. Whereas if your front leg is on the side where the cut is coming from, it's pretty difficult to mess this up. How are you gonna? I shouldn't challenge people. Generally, your leg is safe that way. When you're transitioning from one guard to the other, but with speed and force, that's a cut. So if you're in some kind of high guard, whether it be here or here, and you transition to a low guard, that's a cut. And that's the point. You want to end up in another guard, as opposed to turned away from the opponent or something like that. This is a guard, and that's a guard. This is a guard, and that's a guard. That can even apply to thrusts. For example, plow guard to long point. That's a thrust. You know what's also a thrust? Long point. Just stepping forward. The complexity lies in the interaction between blades, what you do in the bind. For that, you need a practice partner. You can't do that by yourself. I mean, you kind of can. Some people get bicycle repair stands and put the sword on there to practice that, which is okay, but it's a lot better if you actually have someone to feed you, cuts, thrusts, whatever, give you pressure or not, and all of that. But by yourself, the basic thrust is essentially just hold it out and step, right? So essentially, as you're practicing your footwork, you're practicing your thrusts too. You can extend your arm. You don't even necessarily have to do that, because just keeping your arm forward and stepping in aggressively is a thrust. But, still you would normally push the point forward as well to gain more velocity, but that's fairly self-explanatory. Again, by yourself, it's more a matter of knowing how to do it. For example, knowing that you need an overbind and you need to cross the line so your opponent's blade is on the outside. So as you thrust, you're displacing the opponent's blade. But as that's not something you can really practice too well by yourself. One thing you can do by yourself is work on your hand-eye coordination. You can improve the accuracy of your thrusts by working with some kind of target. For example, one of these grip exercise donuts. That's totally what they're called, right? When you're starting out, you might want to go with something larger. Try to keep the blade steady and withdraw it the same way it went in. You can always increase the difficulty by making the target smaller and making it move, but in the beginning, keep it nice and slow and controlled. With a two-handed sword, you have the added complexity of using the other hand. It makes it easier to control the sword, but there's something else to think about. Some people teach to power the cut just with the offhand. If you're right-handed, your left hand is pulling the sword across and the other hand is just guiding it. But there's also the push-pull where this hand, your offhand, pulls a pommel into you basically, or the handle pulls it toward you and the other hand pushes it out. At this point, I like that version more because it can give you a little bit more of a snap. And also, it makes it a little bit easier to move the blade first, because what you don't want to do is this, because then you're just begging for your hands to be struck while you're doing it. You can try to minimize that when powering with just the offhand, but the hands still tend to be more exposed than if you keep the pommel pulled in more. The downside is that the push-pull moves your two hands independently, while the other method keeps them more precisely together, which is why you may have more success in cutting bottles or tatami mats when setting up fairly rigidly in a high guard and pulling through with your offhand. And don't forget to engage the hips. So instead, if you're thinking about pulling this in and pushing the blade out, now the blade is actually moving first. You don't have to do it with a passing step, by the way. You can use an advancing step too. So again, just go with the diagonals. And in fact, you can practice both the true edge and the false edge cut in the same go, because going down like this, you're cutting with the true edge, this one. If you're going straight back up the same way, you're performing a false edge cut, which is often a deflectional parry. Because if you go from here, imagine you're cutting this angle, I step back, and I transition from low guard to high guard. I'm deflecting the sword as it comes in. Same on the other side. If you want to combine it with footwork, you absolutely can. In that case, do your downward cut, and then you switch feet. So your rear foot comes forward as you're raising the sword up, and then your front foot steps back. So 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2. If you feel any sharp pain, stop immediately. Or if you feel have a dull pain that's very persistent, that feels different from sore muscles. You know, soreness is just fine, but a dull, persistent pain, that's a sign that you messed up a tendon or ligament. In which case, stop. Like, don't aggravate it any further. Of course, there's much, much more. So much complex footwork. I haven't actually taught you really a single technique in the sense of not a single master cut really as such. These are all just very basic movements by themselves upon which everything else builds, of course. But if you're just starting out, you can't do everything. And of course, this is also not including any kinds of defensive actions. Well, I mean, evasions are covered by footwork, of course, but there's still a lot more to it. But I wanted to make this as a starting point for people who, as I said, are by themselves. You need people to practice with, because otherwise you can't even practice parries, which is kind of important, obviously. So there's plenty you're missing out on, but even if you are practicing with other people, with instruction, you can still practice footwork by yourself and basic cuts. In fact, you should. If you're only going to class once a week, you're not going to improve that quickly, because just figuring out those basics like footwork is going to take up quite a bit of the time. So that's the kind of thing that you should do as homework, so to speak, so that then you're ready to learn the actual techniques. So hope that's helpful. Let me know if there's enough interest. I may do a follow-up video to this about partner drills. So let me know what you think. Thanks for watching and take care, folks.